They say every hospital has a room with a story that no one wants to talk about. I used to think those stories were just old nurses trying to spook the interns, or a way to cope with all the death we see daily. But then, I started working night shifts at St. Cecilia's, and everything changed. I was a young doctor back then, just a few months out of residency. I liked the calm of the night, fewer patients, fewer rounds, and honestly, fewer chances of messing up. But calm is not the word I would use anymore, not after room 309. My first week on night duty was quiet. I would walk the halls with my clipboard, check vitals, write notes, and occasionally get called to the ER for something minor. The ICU was always dim and still, like time had paused. I never thought much of the empty rooms, until one night, about 2:17 a.m., the phone at the nurse station rang. I was alone. I picked it up. All I heard was breathing, not fast or heavy, just steady, almost too steady. I said hello twice before a voice whispered, "I never left," and then the line went dead. At first, I thought it was a prank, maybe someone bored and messing with internal lines. I checked the caller ID. It said room 309. That made me pause. I had never seen anyone go in or out of that room. I asked one of the senior nurses about it the next day. She got quiet, then just said, "That room is not in use. It is sealed. Fire damage." Years ago, I pressed a bit, but she walked away shaking her head. The calls came again the next night. Same time, same voice. I never left. By the third night, I stopped sleeping properly. I would stare at the clock from 2 a.m. onward, waiting for the ring. When it came, I would answer, hoping to say something different, something to get more, but it never changed. Just that whisper. I never left. No one else ever heard it. No calls during the day. No record in the system. Just me and that voice. I started avoiding the ICU after midnight. I would take the long way around, even if it meant more steps. But somehow, every time I was near 309, I felt it. Cold. Still. Like the air itself was heavier. I once tried to open the door. It was sealed shut. Metal brackets across the frame, like something from a horror movie. Burn marks still stained the lower walls. There were no lights inside, just darkness pressing against the small glass window. I asked an old janitor once, during one of my rare late coffee breaks. He said there had been a fire years ago. Short circuit. Patients could not be moved fast enough. One woman died in 309, burned alive before help could reach her. They sealed the room after that, said it was cursed. He laughed it off after telling me, but he would never mop past that door. I started hearing the whisper even when the phone did not ring. In the elevator, in the supply room, once, even in my sleep. I would jerk awake, heart racing, that voice ringing in my ears. I never left. I started recording the calls. Every night, same time, same voice. My supervisor thought I was burning out and suggested I take a few days off. I refused. I needed to know what was happening. One night, I stayed right by the phone. I had a cup of coffee, a notebook, and my phone recording everything. When the clock hit 2:17, the phone rang. I picked up, but this time, the voice said something else. "Come see me." I froze. My hands were shaking. The line went dead, and I knew I was going to that room, no matter how much I feared it. I walked slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The hallway was colder than usual, my breath visible in the air. Room 309 stood at the end, untouched, sealed and waiting. The window on the door had fogged up. I wiped it. For the first time, I saw something inside. A figure, sitting, back turned, long hair, burnt skin but upright, alive. I stepped back, heart pounding. The figure turned slowly, revealing a charred face, hollow eyes, and lips that barely moved as they mouthed the words I never left. I ran. I did not stop until I was outside, gasping in the cold night air. Security checked the room in the morning. Still sealed. No signs of anyone inside. No footprints. No condensation. But my phone had the voice recorded, clearer than ever. "Come see me." I played it for my supervisor. He just stared at me, pale. That voice, he whispered, belonged to my sister. She died in that room. Years ago, We both stood in silence, the weight of that revelation sinking deep into our bones. I tried to quit after that, but the calls did not stop. Even when I moved to another hospital, I would wake up at 2:17 a.m. My phone would ring. No caller ID, just the whisper. I never left. It was not just about the room anymore. It was about me. I had seen her, heard her. A part of her had clung to me, bound by something I still do not understand. Maybe guilt, maybe grief. Maybe the hospital was just the start. She had found a voice through the wires, and now she follows me in silence. Through every hallway, every shift, every call. I do not answer unknown numbers anymore, but sometimes, when the wind is quiet and the world is asleep, I still hear it in my head, that soft, broken whisper, I never left. And deep down, I know she never did. People always think hospitals are scary places because of the sickness or the smell or maybe the silence in the halls at night. But the truth is, what really haunts you is what you cannot explain. I have worked as a doctor for over 10 years. I have seen death. I have fought for lives. I have walked past the bodies of patients I just could not save. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night. It was a normal shift. Quiet, even. The kind of night when the floors feel too still and your coffee gets cold before you finish it because there is nothing urgent to pull you away. I was stationed in the emergency wing, sitting at the nurse's station, reading an old patient chart just to stay awake. Around 2:13 in the morning, the overhead speaker crackled with a code blue. Operating room 3. At first, I thought it was a mistake. OR3 was not scheduled for any surgeries that night. The entire surgical wing had been cleared by midnight, but the voice on the speaker was clear. Code blue. I looked around. No one else had moved. I asked the nurse on duty if she had heard it too. She nodded slowly, her face pale, like she was waiting for someone else to respond first. I got up, not really thinking too much about it. Sometimes techs mess with settings. Maybe a cleaner hit something by accident. I grabbed my coat and walked down the long hallway toward the OR wing. The hospital was quiet. I remember the lights buzzing slightly overhead and how each step echoed. When I reached OR3, the door was slightly open. The lights inside were on. I pushed the door and stepped in. The room was cold. Not just normal cold. It felt like something had drained the air from the space. Everything looked in place, but the operating table was empty. The heart monitor was on, but flatlined. No beeping, just a solid line and that long, steady tone that usually means someone is gone. I checked the machine. It was running, but there were no wires attached to anything. The defibrillator had been wheeled out and was sitting next to the table, as if someone had used it and just walked away. My first instinct was to check the log. Maybe there had been an emergency. Maybe I missed a late patient, but there was nothing. I turned around and walked back to the security desk. The guy on duty looked nervous. I asked him to pull the hallway footage from a few minutes ago. I just needed to make sure someone had not been messing around in OR3. What I saw on that screen made my stomach twist. The footage showed me walking toward OR3, opening the door, entering the room, but I never came out. The next 10 minutes showed nothing, just an empty hallway. I felt my blood turn to ice. I had been standing in that room only minutes ago. I had come back to the desk. I had talked to the guard. I was here, but on the footage, I was still inside that room. The camera never showed me leaving. I asked him to rewind it. We watched it again. Same thing. I entered, never left, but I was standing right there, alive, real, breathing. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe a glitch. Maybe the camera feed looped wrong. I walked back to OR3 with the guard. The room was locked now, fully shut. He had to unlock it with his keycard. When we stepped inside, the monitor was off. The lights were dim, and on the table, there was a white hospital sheet, folded neatly, with my ID badge placed on top. I swear to you, I never took my badge off. I reached for my coat pocket. The badge was gone. Somehow, it was in that room, waiting on the table like a silent message. The guard backed out of the room without saying a word. I picked up the badge and left quickly. My hands were shaking. I went straight to the main terminal and checked the system logs. All 3 had been marked as sealed since midnight. No entry recorded, no patient scheduled, no staff assigned. But the code blue had happened. It was in the audio logs. The timestamp matched. Yet the system claimed no one had activated it. I stayed up for the rest of the shift, watching the hallway footage again and again. Each time, I saw myself enter that room and never leave. When morning came, I tried to shake it off, told myself it was a weird dream, a hallucination maybe. But when I checked my locker before heading home, my coat was gone, just gone, like someone had taken it while I was working, and in its place was a clean pair of scrubs, my size, neatly folded. I never wore scrubs on night shift, but there they were, waiting, like they had been prepared. I reported everything to the director the next day. He looked at me like I had told him a ghost story, said the cameras sometimes glitch, that sometimes staff forget things when they are tired. He dismissed it all, even smiled a little, like I was being dramatic. But before I left his office, I saw a folder on his desk. It had my name on it. I asked him what it was. He said it was an old personnel file, from someone with the same name, a surgeon who died in the hospital 10 years ago. In OR3, during a failed code blue, his badge number was the same as mine. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because I did not know what else to do. I walked out of his office and went home, tried to sleep, tried to forget, but every night, since then, I hear the flatline sound when I close my eyes. And sometimes, when I wake up in the dark, I feel like I am still inside that room, like I never really walked out. Like the person who left that room was not really me. I do not tell people this story often. Most would not believe it. But if you ever hear a code blue in an empty OR, do not go alone. Sometimes the room remembers, sometimes it calls you back, and sometimes the person who answers is never really the same again. I once read that some horrors do not crawl out of the dark. They wear white coats and speak gently. Maybe that is why I did not see it coming. I have worked as a doctor in this hospital for over a decade. My days used to follow the same quiet rhythm of checkups, rounds, and paperwork. Patients came and went. Some stayed, some did not. I never saw it as strange. Life and death lived in the same building, and I was just a servant to both. It was routine. Until that morning when everything began to shift. I came into work like always. My coffee was still hot in my hand, my stethoscope around my neck, and the usual dull buzz of fluorescent lights humming in the hallways. But there was a file on my desk that should not have been there. A brown patient folder, slightly crumpled, no name, no ID, just a list of symptoms written in red ink. Bleeding from ears, hearing whispers, sudden death. That was it. No history, no dates, just those words. I frowned, thinking maybe it was a prank or some kind of misplaced psych report. I put it aside and forgot about it until later that evening when a patient came into the ER. He was in his 30s, pale, shaking, with blood trickling from both ears. He was terrified. He kept whispering things I could not understand. At first, I thought it was trauma or maybe a seizure. But when I asked what he was hearing, he looked at me with such deep fear and said he could not explain the voices, but they were inside him, and they were not human. He died 30 minutes later. No cause found. The report came back clean. No bleeding in the brain, no stroke, no infection. Just a dead man with terror in his eyes. The next morning, another file appeared. Same brown folder, same red ink. New symptoms, cold sweats, shadows moving on the ceiling, screaming in the ears. Again, no name. That day, a woman came in around noon. She had the exact symptoms, right down to the way she described the shadows. Said they crawled like insects above her bed. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself I was overworked. But the next day, it happened again. A new file, a new patient, same match, different symptoms, always written in that same red ink. It became a pattern, files appearing in the morning, patients arriving later with those exact symptoms. None of the staff ever saw who left the files. I asked around. The nurses said they assumed I had written them. I knew I had not. I started keeping the folders, locked them in my drawer. I counted them, one for each day. one dead patient per file. Some started with things like mild nausea or headaches, but all ended in sudden death. No explanation, no common cause. Every test came back clean. It was like they were being marked for death by those red-inked pages. I stopped sleeping properly. I began checking my office at night. Sometimes I would find the next folder already waiting before sunrise. And sometimes I swore I heard footsteps in the hallway outside, slow and dragging, but no one was ever there. One night I stayed in the hospital past midnight. I hid inside my office, lights off, waiting. At exactly 3 a.m., I heard the door creak. I swear I had locked it. I held my breath as it opened slowly, and something slid a folder across the floor into the room. When I turned on the lights, no one was there, but the folder was. New symptoms, more deaths. The fear started to eat at me. I began to question everything. My memory, my sanity. I looked through the hospital security footage, desperate to catch whoever was delivering the folders. But there was nothing. The footage would glitch out every morning between 2 and 4 a.m. Just static. No movement, no explanation. Some of the patients who survived a little longer before dying said things that made my skin crawl. One told me I was in his dreams every night, standing in a dark hallway, holding a folder dripping in blood. Another grabbed my arm and screamed that I was next, that I was writing my own name. The nurses thought it was stress. The psychologist on staff suggested I take a leave. I refused. I had to know the truth. I began reading all the folders again, looking for patterns, clues, and that is when I noticed something. The handwriting. Every single folder had the same writing, but it was changing over time. Slowly, subtly, each new page was closer to my own, like someone was learning to write like me. I compared them side by side. At first, they looked different, but over the weeks, the letters curved the same way. The spacing matched mine. It was mimicking me, or worse, it was becoming me. This morning, I walked into my office with trembling hands. I already knew what I would find, the final folder. I did not want to open it, but I did. My name was on it, written in that perfect red ink. Underneath, the symptoms were simple: hearing whispers, seeing shadows, bleeding from ears, sudden death. I dropped the folder and staggered back. I felt lightheaded. My ears were ringing. I told myself it was stress, just stress. But then I noticed the silence around me was too thick, like something was pressing against my skull. I could feel movement behind me even though I was alone. I turned around fast. Nothing, but the whispers had started, soft at first, then louder. My own voice repeating the same sentence again and again. It is your turn. It is your turn. I ran to the ER, trying to distract myself, to work, to focus. But everything felt wrong. The patients looked at me like they knew. One nurse stepped back when I passed, staring at my ears. I reached up. My fingers came back red. I am writing this now in the hopes that someone finds it, that someone understands. There is something inside this hospital, something that is feeding off us. It begins with a folder. It ends with death. I do not know what it wants or how it began, but I know how it ends. It ends with me, and maybe you. I used to believe that medicine had an answer for everything, that if we looked closely enough at a scan or measured just the right levels in the blood, we could understand what was happening inside a human body. But the night shift started changing that belief. They stretch long and quiet between the alarms and the coded emergencies, and it is in that silence when the world around you begins to feel like it is holding its breath. I have been a hospital doctor for 11 years now. I work mostly in critical care. That means long hours with machines that beep and breathe for people who cannot do it on their own. I have seen death. I have spoken to families about it, even when it came silently in the middle of the night. But what happened with room 309 was not death. It was something else, something I still cannot explain, though I hear it every night now. It started quietly, like most terrifying things do. The patient in 309 had been brought in after a major stroke. Mid-60s, no family, no visitors. He never woke up. We kept him on a ventilator, hoping his brain would recover enough to bring him back. At night, I would pass by his room during my rounds, check his charts, listen to the soft hiss of the ventilator. That rhythmic in and out always calmed me. It meant he was stable. Until one night, I heard something strange. The machine still made the normal breathing sounds, but under it, like a thread pulled too tight, I heard what sounded like a whisper. I paused, thinking maybe it was a loose wire or interference. But as I stood there longer, I swore I could hear words. Not loud, not clear, but something like a voice buried in static. I leaned closer to the machine and waited. Nothing, just the usual mechanical hum. I told myself I was tired. Maybe my brain was filling in the silence. That happens sometimes when you are running on little sleep. But the next night, it was back. This time, it was louder. Still quiet, still low, but unmistakably a voice. I stood there, frozen, my ears burning as I strained to catch the words. All I heard was a single sentence before the machine returned to its regular pattern. "You are not supposed to be here." The voice was not angry. It was not even loud. It was soft, almost sad. I stepped back, heart thudding in my chest, and checked the machine. It was working fine. No alerts, no errors. I could not explain it. I walked away and told no one. Who would believe me? The next night, I came prepared. I brought a small recorder, one of those we sometimes use during patient interviews. I clipped it to my coat and entered room 309. I stood there again, pretending to check the IVs, pretending to note down vitals, while the recorder captured everything. The ventilator hissed and sighed for several minutes. Nothing strange happened. Then, right as I was about to leave, the voice came again. "You are not supposed to be here." I froze. Same tone, same words. This time, I left the room quickly and went to the break area. I plugged the recorder into my laptop and played it back. At normal speed, the whisper was faint, almost hidden under the sound of airflow. But when I slowed the recording down, I heard it clearly. It was a man's voice. It sounded like it came from inside the machine, not through it, not the patient, but from the ventilator itself. The hair on my arms stood up. I replayed it again and again, until I knew it by heart. Then, I did something I now regret. I returned to room 309 the next night. I had to see if it would happen again. Everything was quiet. The patient had not changed. Same coma, same chart, same machine. I stood there waiting. The voice came again, but this time, something else happened. The patient moved, slowly like someone underwater. His arms twitched, then his torso shifted. I watched, frozen in place, as he sat up. His eyes were still closed. His lips began to move, and he said the words out loud. "You are not supposed to be here." His voice matched the recording exactly. Then, without any struggle or sound, he collapsed back onto the bed. The monitor flatlined 5 minutes later. We tried to revive him. Code blue, full response. But he was gone. No one questioned it much. A coma patient dying is sadly not unusual, but I knew something else had happened. I deleted the recording. I was too afraid someone else would hear it, that it would spread. I wanted it to end, but it did not. In fact, that was only the beginning. A few nights later, I passed by another patient, on a ventilator. Different room, different machine, no connection. And I heard it again, the same voice. "You are not supposed to be here." I stood there for a long time listening, not daring to move. The patient was asleep, recovering from pneumonia. Nothing unusual, but the voice came again, louder this time. I backed away and left the unit. Since then, I have heard it in at least 5 different rooms. I have tried to ignore it. I have tried to convince myself I am just sleep deprived, that my mind is playing tricks. But it only happens at night, only when I am alone, only when I stop to listen. I have asked the tech team to run diagnostics on the machines. They find nothing. I have changed shifts, moved to different wings, but it follows me. And now I hear it even when no one is connected. The machine is powered on, the room is empty, and the voice still comes, soft and calm, like it is trying to tell me something important. "You are not supposed to be here." I think maybe it is right. Maybe I stayed in this job too long. Maybe I have spent too much time around the edge of death. Maybe the machines know something I do not. I stopped recording. I stopped telling people. I just go about my rounds now, pretending everything is normal. But deep down, I know it is not. I keep wondering if one day I will hear the voice say something different. Maybe it will speak my name. Maybe the next time a patient repeats it, they will open their eyes. Maybe they will not die. Maybe I will. Until then, I keep listening. Because once you have heard it, you cannot unhear it. And once you know the machines can whisper, silence becomes the scariest sound of all. People think hospitals are only scary at night, but I have always believed that the real horror hides in daylight, when things are supposed to feel safe. I have been a doctor for 12 years now, and during that time I have seen plenty of strange behavior from patients. But one man in particular stuck with me. He was admitted to the psychiatric unit after being found in the emergency room muttering about a place he called the other waiting room. At first, I thought it was a simple delusion, just one of many that came and went. But then he looked me right in the eyes and said something that made my skin crawl. He whispered that everyone in the other waiting room had their faces wrapped in gauze, and none of them moved, not even to breathe. I thought it was just the illness talking, so I wrote my notes and moved on. But that story stayed with me. It was too specific, too vivid, like something real. Weeks passed, and the hospital started renovations on the lower floors. I was used to navigating the twisting corridors of the old building, but with entire wings closed off and makeshift signs taped to walls, it became a maze. One evening, I was heading back to my office after checking on a patient when I decided to take a shortcut through one of the renovated areas. I had seen staff walk that way before. The lights were dim, the walls stripped bare, the floor covered in sheets of dusty plastic. I remember thinking it felt colder in that part of the hospital. Not freezing, just strangely cold, like the warmth of life did not belong there. I kept walking until I reached a hallway I did not recognize. It was not on the map, and the lighting was weaker than anywhere else in the building. The walls were painted a dull gray, the floor tiled with pale squares that looked like bone. At first, I thought I had simply taken a wrong turn. Hospitals are full of strange corners, old storage rooms, and forgotten wings. But the silence in this hallway was different. I could not hear the usual hum of machines or the distant beeping of monitors. Even my footsteps sounded muted. I was about to turn back when I noticed a frosted glass door at the very end of the hall. It had no markings, no signs, just a simple metal handle. Something in me said to walk away, but curiosity overpowered caution. I opened the door and stepped inside what looked like a waiting room. The walls were the same dull gray. There were 6 chairs lined against the wall, and 5 of them were occupied. The people sitting there were motionless, their heads wrapped completely in white gauze. Not a single gap for eyes, mouth, or nose. Just white cloth stretched tight around every head. Their hands were resting on their laps, fingers stiff and pale. I felt an unnatural stillness in the room, as if time itself was holding its breath. I tried to speak, to ask if anyone needed help, but my voice came out too quiet. I did not even hear it echo. The people did not react. They did not flinch or turn their heads. They just sat there, frozen. I took a step forward, and one of them began to stand. The motion was painfully slow, like watching a puppet pulled by invisible strings. The others remained seated, as still as statues. My heart pounded as the standing figure raised both hands to its head and began to unwrap the gauze. Layer after layer, the cloth fell to the floor in silence. I wanted to move, to run, but my legs refused. My body locked in place while my mind screamed. The gauze finally slipped from the figure's face, and I saw what was underneath. It was me, my face, my eyes, my expression, a perfect reflection, only wrong. The mouth stretched too wide, the eyes too empty, the skin too smooth like a wax figure made to mock me. I could not look away. Then the lights flickered. When they came back on, the figure was gone. The other people were gone too. The room was empty. I stood alone, drenched in sweat, my pulse racing. I rushed out of the room, back down the hallway, and found myself somehow near the elevators, though I had no idea how I got there. I did not speak about it to anyone. I convinced myself it was stress, maybe even a hallucination. But the next morning, when I looked in the mirror, I noticed a faint red line across my forehead, the exact place where the gauze had started on that other face. I began to dig into the hospital's old records. I found references to a waiting room used in the 1940s that was part of a wing, damaged in a fire. It had been sealed off and forgotten. No one knew about it anymore. But the blueprint showed a hallway, grey walls, and a door at the end. It matched exactly. I returned to that section of the hospital a week later. The hallway was gone. In its place was a concrete wall. No door, no sign it had ever been open. I asked maintenance, and they said no such hallway ever existed. I asked administration. Same answer. I checked the blueprint again. The page was missing from the records room, completely gone. Then the nightmare started. I would dream of that waiting room, of sitting in one of the chairs, my head wrapped in gauze. The others around me never moved, but I could feel them watching. Every night, I would wake up gasping, sometimes with blood on my pillow from scratching at my own face in my sleep. I stopped sleeping. I stopped working. I eventually quit the hospital altogether. But no matter how far I go, I still see that hallway in my dreams. Sometimes, when I pass a mirror, I pause because, for a split second, I see the other me looking back, the one with empty eyes and no soul. I never found out what that room really was. Some say hospitals remember pain, that the walls hold memories of suffering. Maybe that place was a memory of something too awful to fully die. Or maybe it is still there, hidden behind walls and renovations, waiting for the next lost soul to find it. All I know is, the man who warned me about it was not insane. He saw something, and now I have too. So if you ever walk through a hospital and the air suddenly turns cold and silent, turn back. Do not open the door at the end of the hallway. Do not look inside. And whatever you do not unwrap the gauze. They say hospitals never sleep. I used to believe that was just a saying, something we told ourselves to justify the long hours and late shifts. But after what happened to me in -4, I know it means something else, something darker. I have worked as a doctor for over 10 years, and strange things have always been part of the job. Patients saying they saw people in the room when no one was there, machines turning on without being touched. I brushed it off like everyone else. Stress, exhaustion, the weight of death pressing down on the walls. But there is one memory I cannot forget, and no matter how much I try, it keeps me up at night. Every detail is carved into my mind like a name scratched into stone. It started as a normal night. I was on the graveyard shift, moving between patients, checking charts, sipping lukewarm coffee from a paper cup. I had been assigned to the east wing of St. Germain Hospital, the oldest part of the building, with creaking floors and yellow lights that always seemed a little too dim. That night, I had this weird feeling, like someone was watching me, but every time I looked over my shoulder, the halls were empty. Around 2:45 a.m., I was in the staff lounge reviewing test results when I heard the soft beep of a pager going off, but it was not mine. I looked around, expecting to see another resident or nurse nearby, but the room was empty. Then I saw it on the counter by the microwaver, dusty, old pager blinking red. One message, or -4. Time, 3:07 a.m. At first I thought it was a joke. Maybe one of the nurses was playing around, but something about the time hit me like a chill. I remembered the story. 3 years ago, Dr. Holloway died in -4 at exactly 3:07 a.m. Cardiac arrest during an emergency procedure. Everyone knew the story. Some said his ghost still wandered the halls. Others claimed the pager he carried would light up at the same time every night, asking for help. I never believed it. I had laughed at the stories with the others, rolled my eyes when nurses talked about feeling cold spots near the operating room. But now I was holding that pager in my hand, and it was real. It was blinking, or -4, 3:07 a.m. Something told me to ignore it, just walk away, go back to rounds. But I could not. My legs were moving before I realized what I was doing. I passed through the dim hallway, every step echoing louder than it should. When I reached or -4, the door was already cracked open. A faint blue light flickered from inside. I pushed it open slowly. The room was freezing, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. The surgical lights above the table buzzed and blinked like they were struggling to stay alive. And then I saw him. Dr. Holloway was lying on the floor in blood-soaked scrubs, one hand clutching his chest, the other reaching toward the operating table. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror, lips trembling. I froze. My mind told me this could not be real. He was dead, dead for years, but his mouth moved. "Help me." I heard the words, weak, broken, but clear. I dropped to my knees beside him and reached for his wrist. No pulse. I shouted for help, my voice cracking as I yelled into the hallway. I called for a crash cart. I began CPR. My gloves were wet, slippery with blood. It was warm, fresh. He looked at me, his eyes locked onto mine, as if pleading for something I could not give. And then I blinked. When I looked up, he was gone. The blood, the body, everything, just gone. I was alone. My hands were still shaking, soaked in blood that had no source. The floor was clean, the surgical table empty, but the smell of iron still hung thick in the air. The team burst in a moment later, responding to my call. They looked around, confused, asked what happened. I could not speak. I just stared at my hands, red and dripping. I was sent home early. They said I was overworked, maybe even hallucinating. The blood on my gloves had vanished by the time I reached the staff locker. Nothing to test, nothing to prove what I had seen. I tried to move on. I avoided the East Wing. I told myself it was stress, sleep deprivation. But the next week, at exactly 3:07 a.m., the pager lit up again, or -4. And the week after that, I never went back. I pretended not to see it, told myself if I ignored it, it would go away. But it did not. The nurses whisper about it when they think no one is listening. Some say they hear footsteps coming from the room late at night. Others claim to hear someone calling for help, always at 3:07, always from behind a closed door. Then last week, a new intern named Grace asked me about the pager. She had found it blinking in the lounge, just like I had. She looked pale, shaken. I told her to forget about it, to throw it away. She did not listen. She went to OR, -4. That night, we found her the next morning in the staff showers, still wearing her scrubs, curled into a ball on the floor, whispering the same words over and over. "Help me, help me." Her hands were covered in blood, but there were no injuries. No one else's blood was found. She has not spoken since. Now the pager sits locked in a drawer in my office, but I can still hear it sometimes. That soft beep in the middle of the night. I cover my ears. I close my eyes. But I know what it wants. Dr. Holloway is still in there, still dying, still begging for help that never comes. And I think, maybe he always will be. Maybe that room is a loop, a place trapped in time, where death never finishes and pain never ends. I do not know why I was chosen to see it. Maybe because I cared, maybe because I listened, or maybe because one day I will be the one lying there on that floor, reaching out, watching someone else walk in, only to vanish before their eyes, just like he did, just like I will.